There is a painting. It is not enormous. It is not the kind of canvas that dominates a room with its scale. It is the kind of painting that commands a room with something else, with the quality of attention that radiates from it, the specific intensity of a human face rendered by a genius who understood something about the interior life of his subjects that most painters never reach. It is a portrait, a woman, dark eyes that hold a secret the painter knew, and the viewer spends years trying to read. The elongated neck, the tilted head, the specific Modigliani geometry that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever stood in front of one of his works and felt the strange intimacy of being looked at by a face that has been dead for over a century. The painting has a name. It has a provenance, a history of ownership that stretches back to the early 20th century, to the cafes and studios of Paris, to a Jewish art dealer who understood what he was buying when he bought it, and who loved it the way you love a thing that speaks directly to something in you that has no other language. And then history happened, the specific history that the 20th century produced for Jewish families in Europe, the confiscations, the deportations, the systematic theft conducted by a government that had decided certain people did not deserve to own beautiful things, or to exist at all. The painting survived. The man who owned it did not. The painting traveled, as looted art travels, to the hands of collaborators and dealers and collectors, and eventually into the gleaming white spaces of a major museum, where it hung for decades as a cultural treasure, admired by thousands of visitors who did not know its full story, or who knew some of it and chose not to ask the question that its full story demands. Who does this painting belong to? One family spent 11 years in court asking that question. 11 years of lawyers and depositions and appeals and counterarguments and a specific, grinding, expensive, exhausting legal process that restitution cases require when the people holding stolen property are powerful enough to make keeping it difficult. And at the end of those 11 years, the answer, the painting goes home. This is that story. Before the theft, before the courts, before the 11 years, before all of it, there was a man with a paintbrush in a Paris studio. Amedeo Modigliani was born in Livorno, Italy, in 1884. He was the youngest of 4 children in a Sephardic Jewish family that had known better days. His father's business had failed shortly before his birth, and the family that had once been prosperous was now scrambling. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that when bailiffs came to seize the family's belongings for debt, his mother gathered the family's most precious possessions onto bed where Amedeo lay as a newborn, because Italian law protected items in the possession of a woman in childbed. The family's survival instinct, from the beginning, was theatrical and clever. Modigliani was sick for most of his life. Tuberculosis, first diagnosed when he was a teenager, would shadow him to his death. He traveled to Paris in 1906, the art capital of the world, the city where Picasso and Matisse and Braque were remaking what painting could be, and he dove into it with the specific ferocity of someone who understands that time is short. He drank. He used drugs. He was, by every account, extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily generous and extraordinarily self-destructive. He was a romantic ideal of the starving artist made flesh, except that the starvation was real and the romance was sometimes ugly and the genius was absolutely authentic. He painted portraits, nudes, sculptures. He had a specific visual language that is immediately recognizable. Those elongated necks, those almond-shaped eyes, those faces tilted at an angle that suggests simultaneous vulnerability and mystery. His subjects look at you directly or look past you, and in either case you feel that you are in the presence of something that has been seen and understood. He sold almost nothing during his lifetime. He traded paintings for meals, for wine, for the rent he perpetually owed. He was celebrated in certain circles and ignored by the broader art world. He lived in poverty and died in poverty of tubercular meningitis in January 1920 at the age of 35. His pregnant partner, Jean Hebuterne, threw herself from a 5th-floor window the day after his death. They were buried apart, initially. Later, after significant effort by their families, they were buried together in Père Lachaise Cemetery. The inscription on the stone reads, "Devoted companion to the extreme sacrifice." Within years of his death, Modigliani's work became extraordinarily valuable. By the time the Nazis came to power in Germany and began extending their reach across Europe, a Modigliani was not a painting that a starving artist had traded for a meal. It was a significant financial asset, the kind of thing that the systematic looters of the Nazi regime identified, cataloged, seized, and disposed of according to their own purposes. Oskar Stettiner was a Paris art dealer. He was Jewish. He was successful. He had built a gallery, a real gallery, with a reputation and relationships and the specific expertise of a man who had spent a professional life understanding what makes art valuable and why. He had acquired the Modigliani. The specific details of the acquisition vary depending on the source. The art world of early 20th century Paris was a fluid, informal marketplace where provenance documentation was not always rigorous. But what is established is that Stettiner owned the painting. It was in his possession. It was documented in his records. It was his. And then the Germans came. The occupation of France began in June 1940. For Jewish residents of Paris, the occupation meant a rapidly escalating series of restrictions, humiliations, and dangers. Jewish businesses were to be registered. Jewish property was to be identified and eventually seized. Jewish people were to be concentrated, controlled, and ultimately, though the full scope of this was not immediately visible to those living through it, destroyed. Oskar Stettiner fled Paris. He had to. Staying was death. He fled, as many Jewish Parisians fled in those years, leaving behind what he could not carry, including his gallery, including his inventory, including the Modigliani. The painting was seized. It entered the machinery of Nazi looting, the vast, bureaucratically efficient system by which the Third Reich stripped occupied Europe of its cultural patrimony, confiscating privately owned works by Jewish collectors and dealers for the personal enrichment of Nazi officials, for state museums in Germany, or simply for resale through channels that converted stolen art into cash and influence. The specific journey of this painting through those years, who handled it, who sold it, who bought it, who knew what they were buying, is part of what the Restitution case spent 11 years establishing. What is clear is this. When the war ended, the painting was not with Stettiner. It was somewhere else. And it would be decades before his descendants understood fully where it had been and who had been looking at it. The end of World War II did not immediately resolve the question of looted art. It is easy, from a historical distance, to assume that the liberation of Europe was followed quickly by the return of stolen property to its rightful owners. The reality was far more complicated and far less just. The scale of the looting was staggering. The Nazis and their collaborators had confiscated an estimated 1/5 of all the art in Europe, hundreds of thousands of objects, paintings, sculptures, drawings, furniture, books, religious objects, jewelry. The accumulated cultural heritage of Jewish families and communities stripped away with bureaucratic efficiency. The post-war restitution process was inadequate to this scale. It was hampered by incomplete records, by the destruction of documentation during the war, by the complexity of tracking objects that had passed through multiple hands across multiple countries, and by the simple fact that many of the people who had owned these objects were dead. Dead in the camps, dead in the ghettos, dead in the mass shootings, dead without heirs, or with heirs who were themselves survivors carrying the specific psychic burden of survival that left little room for legal battles over paintings. The Western Allied governments made efforts at restitution. They established repositories, the central collecting points, where recovered art was gathered. But the process of returning specific objects to specific families required documentation that did not always exist and administrative that was not always present. And as the years passed, as the Cold War became a defining geopolitical reality, as Europe rebuilt and moved on, as the generation that had lived through the Holocaust aged and in many cases died, the looted art settled into its new locations, into museum collections, into private hands, into the inventories of dealers who had acquired pieces without asking too many questions about where they came from. The silence about looted art lasted for decades. It lasted until the 1990s, until the specific combination of events that finally broke it open: the fall of the Soviet Union and the release of archives, the approaching millennium and its particular pressure toward historical reckoning, the death of the generation of survivors, and the passing of their stories to children and grandchildren who had the distance and the resources to ask questions the survivors themselves had sometimes been unable to ask. And in 1998, the Washington Principles. 44 countries gathered in Washington, D.C., and signed a set of principles for dealing with Nazi-looted art. non-binding but significant, a collective acknowledgement that the problem existed, that it was not resolved, and that the world's museums and cultural institutions had an obligation to investigate their collections for looted works and to work toward just and fair solutions with the heirs of original owners. The Washington Principles did not return a single painting, but they created the framework within which paintings could be returned, and they started a clock. For the descendants of Oscar Stettiner, the journey toward reclaiming the Modigliani was not a single moment of discovery. It was a gradual, painful, decade-long process of assembling the evidence of what had been lost and where it had gone. This is the experience of virtually every family involved in art restitution. You do not simply learn one day that a famous painting belongs to your family. You learn it in pieces, an archive here, a dealer's record there, a catalog entry in a library in a city you have never visited, a photograph in a file that has been sitting untouched since 1946. The researchers who do this work, the provenance researchers who specialize in tracing the histories of artworks through the chaos and destruction of the Nazi period, describe their work as the closest thing to archaeology that the legal world produces. You are digging through layers of time and bureaucracy and deliberate obfuscation to find the truth that was buried. For the Stettiner heirs, the research established a chain of evidence, pre-war documentation showing Oscar Stettiner's ownership, records from the Nazi looting apparatus showing the confiscation of his gallery's inventory, post-war sale records showing the painting's emergence into the legitimate art market, sold, presumably in good faith by some and in bad faith by others, passed along to the dealer network that connected Europe and America, and that was not always scrupulous about the questions it asked. And eventually, in a museum, the painting that had been taken from Oscar Stettiner's gallery was hanging on the wall of a museum, being admired, being studied, being reproduced in catalogs and taught in university art history courses, and loaned to other institutions for their exhibitions, being enjoyed by a world that did not know or did not ask where it come from. The heirs asked, and then the legal process began. The specific painting at the center of the most prominent recent Modigliani restitution case is Portrait of Lunia Ciechowska. Lunia Ciechowska was a real person, a Polish woman who was part of Modigliani's Paris circle, a friend and frequent subject. He painted her multiple times. The portraits that survive show a woman of striking presence, dark features, the specific Modigliani geometry of face and neck, an expression that hovers between melancholy and defiance. The painting passed through Oscar Stettiner's ownership. It was seized during the occupation. It ended up, after the war, in the collection of a major institution, the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, the Museum of Modern Art of the City of Paris, a museum owned by the City of Paris, a public institution, funded by taxpayers, governed by the city government, displaying a painting that had been stolen from a Jewish art dealer by the Nazi occupation of the city in which the museum stands. The Stettiner heirs filed for restitution. The City of Paris contested it. For 11 years. Here is the part of the story that makes people angry. A major museum, a public institution, a cultural organization whose entire stated purpose is the preservation and public presentation of human artistic achievement. An institution that is supposed to represent the highest values of civilization, fighting to keep a painting that was stolen from a Jewish family by the Nazis. For 11 years. Why? The answer is complicated, and the complications do not entirely excuse the behavior, but they do explain it, in the way that understanding something does not require approving of it. Museums have institutional interests that are separate from their stated cultural mission. Their collections of their identity, their prestige, their funding, their attendance figures. A significant work removed from the collection is a significant loss in multiple senses: financial, reputational, curatorial. The legal standards for restitution are high and contested. Establishing ownership requires documentation that does not always exist in complete form. Proving that a specific confiscation was a Nazi looting rather than a legitimate wartime transaction requires navigating archives that are incomplete and contested. Museums have legal teams whose job is to find every defensible argument, and in many restitution cases there are defensible arguments to be found. Gaps in documentation, disputes about chains of title, questions about which legal standard applies. And there is the precedent problem. If a museum acknowledges that one work in its collection was looted and returns it, what does that say about the other works? Major museum collections across Europe and America contain numerous works that were acquired during or after the war under circumstances that would not survive modern scrutiny. The institutional fear is that opening the door to one claim opens the door to all of them. This fear is real. It is also, many argue, a reason to open the door rather than keep it closed. The presence of stolen property in a collection is not protected by the fear of how much more stolen property might exist alongside it. But this is the calculation that museums make. And it is the calculation that kept the Stettiner family in court for 11 years. 11 years. Let me make that concrete. 2013 to 2024. The span of time between the Stettiner heirs formally claiming the painting and the final ruling in their favor. During those 11 years, children who were born when the case began started middle school. People who were young adults when it started entered their 30s. People who were elderly when it started did not live to see its conclusion. The legal process itself is grinding in ways that make even the most determined claimant doubt their capacity to continue. Depositions. Expert witnesses on both sides offering conflicting interpretations of the historical record. Appeals of preliminary rulings. Counterclaims questioning the completeness of the heirs' documentation. Arguments about jurisdiction. Which court, which country's law applies, which standard of proof is required. Arguments about the specific nature of the confiscation. Was it a forced sale under duress, which creates a different legal claim than outright seizure? Arguments about what constitutes sufficient evidence of ownership when the original documentation was destroyed or seized along with the art. The financial cost is extraordinary. Restitution lawyers are specialists. Expert witnesses in provenance research charge professional rates. Court costs in multiple jurisdictions. Translation of documents from French and German and the various bureaucratic languages of the Nazi administrative apparatus. Travel, research, years of time from multiple professionals, all of it billable. The emotional cost is harder to quantify but arguably greater. To spend 11 years in active legal combat over a painting, to have your grandfathers or great-grandfathers suffering reduced to disputed exhibits in a court filing, to watch an institution you might have admired argue, with expensive lawyers and considerable rhetorical skill, that the man who built your family's collection did not really own what everyone agrees was in his possession. This is its own form of continuing injustice. The Stettiner heirs persisted. Not everyone does. Some families reach a settlement short of full return. Some exhaust their resources before the case is resolved. Some simply give up because the human cost of continuing is too high. The Stettiner heirs did not give up. The 1998 Washington Principles were supposed to change this. The 44 signatory countries, including France, committed to identifying Nazi-looted art in their public collections, publishing provenance research, and working toward just and fair solutions with the heirs of original owners. Just and fair solutions. The language is deliberately vague. It does not say return. It does not establish a legal obligation. It does not create an enforcement mechanism. It says just and fair, and it leaves the definition of those words to the discretion of the institutions holding the art. France created a commission, the Commission for the Compensation of Victims of Spoliation, known by its French acronym CVS. The commission reviews claims and makes recommendations. It does not have the power to compel return. The gap between the aspiration of the Washington Principles and the reality of the restitution process is one of the defining frustrations of the field. Germany has generally been more proactive. The German Lost Art Foundation maintains databases, coordinates research, and facilitates returns. The German federal government has demonstrated genuine political will to address the legacy of looting. France has been more complicated. French institutions, including the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris in the Stettiner case, have been criticized for using the French legal system's procedural complexity as a tool for delay rather than a pathway to resolution. The Stettiner case played out against this backdrop of international aspirations and national institutional resistance. Each year the case was a year in which the gap between what the Washington Principles promised and what the French legal system delivered was on display. The eventual ruling in favor of the Stettiner heirs was not simply a victory for one family. It was a statement about what just and fair actually requires. While the Stettiner family was fighting in court, the broader world of high-end art was conducting its own reckoning, slowly, reluctantly, with a specific institutional resistance of a system that profits from not asking certain questions. The dirty secret of the art world is that the systematic looting of the Nazi period did not create a clean break in the provenance of stolen works. The works did not sit in warehouses labeled stolen Jewish property until they were found and returned. They were sold again, clean to the hands of successive dealers and collectors until they emerged into major collections with provenances that were, by design or by neglect, incomplete in the specific years between 1933 and 1945. The years 1933 to 1945 are the tell. A painting whose ownership history has a gap in those years is a painting that requires questions, not a painting that is automatically stolen. There were legitimate transactions during those years, but a painting that requires investigation. For decades, those questions were not asked. Auction houses moved works with incomplete provenances without flagging the gaps. Museums acquired works without conducting the research that would have identified the issues. Private collectors bought at auction without inquiring too deeply into what the catalog entry did not say. Some of this was ignorance. Some was willful blindness. Some was the specific economic incentive that exists when asking the question might mean the object has to be returned. The founding of the Art Loss Register in 1990, a database of stolen and looted artworks that dealers, auction houses, and collectors can search before a transaction, was an acknowledgement that the problem existed and that the market needed tools to address it. The creation of provenance research departments at major museums in the late 1990s, following the Washington Principles, was another acknowledgement. But acknowledgement and action are different things. The Stettiner case, in which a museum with a provenance research department fought for 11 years to keep a painting that its own research should have identified as problematic, illustrates the gap between having the tools and using them honestly. The Stettiner family did not fight alone. No restitution claimant does. Behind every successful case is a network of researchers, lawyers, advocates, and historians who do the painstaking work of building the evidentiary record and navigating the legal systems of multiple countries. Provenance researchers are a specific category of specialists, historians with training in archival research, language skills in the relevant languages, and deep knowledge of the bureaucratic systems that the Nazis used to document their looting. These systems were thorough. The Germans documented everything, which means the evidence of the looting exists in archives, in Germany, in France, in Austria, in the repositories of the Allied forces established after the war. Finding it and interpreting it requires expertise. Organizations like the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, founded in 1999, provide research services and advocacy for families seeking the return of cultural property. The Art Loss Register maintains the searchable database. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, established in 1951 and still active, advocates for restitution at the policy level and provides resources for individual claimants. The German government's Lost Art Foundation coordinates research and maintains the Lost Art Internet database, one of the most comprehensive tools available for identifying objects with problematic provenances. Without these organizations and the people who staff them, the Stettiner case, and hundreds of others like it, would be impossible to pursue, because the families themselves, however determined, do not have the archival expertise, the language skills, the institutional relationships, and the database access that effective restitution research requires. The support infrastructure is essential, and it is chronically underfunded, because the organizations that would most benefit from keeping stolen art are the ones with the most resources. Let us step back from the legal and historical narrative for a moment and think about the painting itself. Portrait of Lunia Ciechowska, created in Paris sometime around 1918 or 1919. The specific year is debated. Modigliani's work is not always reliably dated, but approximately 100 years ago, in a studio in Montmartre or Montparnasse, a dying genius in his mid-30s stood before a canvas and painted a woman he knew. What has this painting seen in the century since? The studio where it was created, the early life of modernist Paris, the cafes, the arguments about art, the specific electric atmosphere of a city that was in the years after World War I. Try to understand what happened and what art meant in the aftermath. The gallery of Oscar Stettiner, the professional world of the Paris art market, dealers and collectors, and the specific commerce of beautiful objects, the occupation, the specific horror of Paris under Nazi rule, the yellow stars, the roundups, the empty departments, the galleries stripped of their inventory. Whatever happened to the painting in those years, whoever held it, whoever transported it, whoever exchanged money for it, it moved through the worst period of the 20th century, the post-war art market, the reconstruction of Europe, the decades of the painting's display in a public museum, seen by thousands of visitors who stood before it and felt whatever people feel when they stand before Modigliani and look into those dark almond eyes. And then the legal process, the 11 years of arguments about its ownership, its provenance, its rightful place, years during which the painting hung on a museum wall while lawyers argued about it in courtrooms. And finally, the ruling, the return. A painting that survived the 20th century is going home. Not to the home it started in. That home is gone. Its owner is gone. The Paris of Oscar Stettiner is gone. But to the family that connects, through blood and through law and to the long determined pursuit of justice, to the man who bought it and loved it and from whom it was taken by force. The ruling, when it finally came, established several things. First, that Oscar Stettiner's ownership of the painting before the war was established by sufficient documentary evidence. The pre-war records, gallery inventories, exhibition catalogs, correspondence, documented his possession clearly enough to satisfy the legal standard proof. Second, that the painting's departure from his ownership during the German occupation of Paris was not a voluntary transaction. The circumstances of the occupation, the legal restrictions imposed on Jewish business owners, the atmosphere of coercion and fear, the systematic Nazi program of Aryanization of Jewish property, meant that any transfer that occurred during this period could not be treated as a legitimate sale reflecting the owner's free will. Third, that the chain of title from the wartime transfer to the museum's acquisition was sufficiently tainted by the original theft that subsequent good faith purchasers could not extinguish the original owner's claim. Fourth, that the appropriate remedy was return, not compensation, not a cash payment in lieu of the physical work. Return, the painting itself, the actual canvas that Modigliani had worked on in 1918 or 1919. The actual object that Oscar Stettiner had owned and loved. The actual presence that had hung on a museum wall for decades while his heirs waited for the legal system to acknowledge what everyone who looked at the evidence had understood. The ruling was not unanimous in every aspect. The legal reasoning was contested at various stages. There will be appeals and further proceedings in some dimensions of the case. But the core determination, this painting was stolen and it must be returned, was made. After 11 years, what happens when a painting is returned? The logistics are mundane. The painting is carefully packaged. The specific archival packaging that major works require, the climate control, the padded crating, the insurance valuation that makes even the transportation feel momentous. It is moved from the museum to wherever the heirs designate. But around the logistics, something less mundane happens. Restitution ceremonies. The formal acknowledgement of return that accompanies a transfer of significant works are unlike other events in the art world. They have a specific emotional register that people who attend them struggle to describe fully. There is grief. Grief for the original owners who are not there to receive the work. Grief for the years. In this case, 11 years of legal battle, and before that, decades of the painting's absence from the family. That cannot be recovered. Grief for the world that was destroyed alongside the objects. There is anger, controlled, formal, appropriate to the occasion, but present. The anger of people who know that this return required 11 years, because an institution with resources chose resistance over justice. The anger of people who know that for every Stettiner case that reaches a successful conclusion, there are many others that do not, that end in inadequate settlements or in families exhausted by the process, or in works that will never be found. There is something else, too, something that the people who attend these ceremonies describe as the closest thing to repair that the situation allows. Not full repair. Nothing repairs what was done, but partial, a tear in the fabric of justice, sewn partially shut, a family's connection to its history restored, imperfectly but meaningfully. The painting comes out of its crating. and is placed where the family can see it. And in that moment, whatever the legal process was, whatever arguments were made, whatever documents were filed, in that moment, it is simply a painting by a great artist and a family looking at something that belonged to them. The Stettiner case is one painting, one family, one 11-year legal battle. How many more are there? The honest answer is, we do not fully know. Estimates of the total number of Nazi-looted art objects range from 100,000 to as many as 650,000 individual works. The range reflects a fundamental difficulty of counting things that were moved in secret, documented incompletely, and have since passed through multiple hands and multiple transactions. Of these, a significant portion have been returned through various restitution processes over the decades since the Washington Principles. The German government's Lost Art Foundation has facilitated thousands of returns. Individual museums and private collectors have returned works voluntarily. Court cases in multiple countries have compelled returns. But a large number, the estimates vary, but the figure of 100,000 still unclaimed or unidentified works appears frequently in research literature, are still out there in museum collections, in private hands, in the inventories of dealers who have not conducted the research that would identify them. Every major museum in the Western world has works in its collection that were acquired during or shortly after the period 1933 to 1945 under circumstances that would not survive modern provenance scrutiny. Not all of these works are looted. Some were legitimately acquired. But the systematic examination of these collections, the research that the Washington Principles call for, has not been completed. Some museums have been thorough and honest in this process. Many have not. The Stettiner case should serve as a reminder that the work is not done, that the Washington Principles' aspiration, just and fair solutions, requires more than good intentions. It requires the institutional willingness to conduct genuine research and act on what the research reveals, even when acting means returning a significant work from your collection. For every Stettiner case, for every family that persists for 11 years and ultimately receives the ruling they deserved, there are others, families that pursued restitution and did not succeed. The failure modes are various. Some cases fail because the documentation does not meet the legal standard required. The pre-war ownership record exists, but is incomplete, a gap in the chain of evidence that the opposing lawyers exploit. The historical record is sufficient to convince any reasonable person of what happened, but not sufficient by the technical standard that the law requires. Some cases fail because of statutes of limitations. Some jurisdictions impose time limits on restitution claims, limits that were set without full appreciation of how long it takes for families to identify stolen works and build the evidence to claim them. By the time a family learns that their grandmother's painting is in a museum in another country, the clock may have already run out. Some cases fail because of forum shopping by the institutions holding the work, choosing to litigate in jurisdictions where the legal standards favor the possessor over the original owner. Some cases end in settlements that fall short of return, a cash payment in lieu of the physical work, a shared ownership arrangement, a deal that the institution's lawyers offer, and the family's resources force them to accept. Not justice, but the end of the fight. Some cases simply run out of money. Restitution litigation is expensive. 11 years of legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions is not a process that most families can afford. Some claimants reach a point where continuing the case requires resources they do not have. The institutional advantage in these cases is real and profound. Museums have legal departments. They have institutional budgets that include litigation costs. They have decades to wait and the patience of organizations that are not personally affected by the outcome. The families have their determination, their documentation, their lawyers, often working on contingency for at least part of the case, because no other arrangement would make the litigation financially possible. The Stettiner family won. Not every family does. Why does it matter? This is a question that is sometimes asked with genuine curiosity rather than bad faith. Why fight for 11 years over a painting? What does a physical object matter when what was truly lost, Oscar Stettiner's life, the world that produced him, the community that surrounded him, cannot be returned by any court ruling? The answer operates on multiple levels. The most immediate, the painting has significant financial value. A Modigliani at auction sells for tens of millions of dollars. The restitution of such a work is not merely symbolic. It is a recovery of a financial asset that was stolen, that was taken from a Jewish family as part of a program of theft that was inseparable from the program of murder. The theft and the murder were part of the same project. Returning the stolen property does not undo the murder, but failing to return it is a continuation of the theft. The deeper level, objects carry history. A painting owned by Oscar Stettiner is not merely a financial asset. It is a piece of his life, a connection to his taste, his judgment, his understanding of art, a link between a man who lived and chose and built something, and the descendants who carry his name and his memory. Returning the painting restores something intangible but real, the deepest level. The restitution process is itself a form of historical justice. It is an acknowledgement by the legal systems of democratic countries that what happened was wrong, that the theft was illegitimate, that the subsequent possession, however many transactions removed from the original theft, does not extinguish the original owner's claim, that the law can reach across decades to undo injustice. This acknowledgement matters, not only for the families who receive it, for the broader society that makes it. It says something about what we believe and what we will not tolerate, about whether the rule of law has a long enough memory to address the worst things that happened within living memory. The Stettiner family's 11-year struggle was not just for a painting. It was for all of that. Oscar Stettiner died. His children aged. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren are the ones who pursued the restitution case. They did not personally know the man whose property was stolen. They know him through stories, through documents, through the careful reconstruction that families do when they're trying to understand where they came from and what was taken from them. This generational distance creates its own complexities. The emotional relationship to the stolen work is real, but different from what it would be for the person from whom it was taken. The grandchild who recovers the painting did not lose it. Their grandparent did. The grief they feel is for someone they may never have known, filtered through the specific melancholy of historical loss. But the legal claim is intact. Most restitution frameworks recognize that claims pass through inheritance, that the heirs and original owner have the right to pursue the return of what was taken, regardless of how many generations have intervened. And the motivation of the next generation is, in many cases, as strong as anything the original owner would have felt, because the theft was not only of an object, it was of a history, a continuity, a family's connection to its own past. Recovering the painting is not only about the painting, it is about the restoration of that continuity. The refusal to accept that the theft is the end of the story. The young lawyers and researchers and family members who pursue these cases today are doing so with full knowledge of how long it takes and what it costs and how uncertain the outcome is. They choose to pursue them anyway. This choice is itself a form of the defiance that the thieves hope to extinguish. They thought they were stealing the future, as well as the present. They were wrong. There is another dimension to the Modigliani story that runs alongside the restitution narrative: authentication. The value of Modigliani's work, and the relative scarcity of his authenticated output, given that he died at 35 after only about 15 years of serious painting, has created an extraordinary incentive for forgery. The Modigliani market has been plagued by questions of authenticity for decades. The artist left no catalog raisonné, no definitive scholarly inventory of his authenticated works, and the lack of such a document has created a space in which disputed attributions and outright forgeries have circulated. The Modigliani Institute in Rome, established to study and catalog his work, has been at the center of both authentication decisions and controversy. Prominent forgery scandals have shaken the market. In 2017, a major Modigliani retrospective in Genoa was partially shut down after it emerged that several of the exhibited works were suspected forgeries. This authentication landscape complicates restitution cases. When a family claims specific work as belonging to their ancestor, the physical object must be authenticated as a genuine Modigliani that the historical documentation describes. The possibility of a switch, that the genuine work was replaced with a copy at some point in its complicated journey, must be addressed. The Stettiner case required not only historical and legal argumentation, but physical examination of the work, technical analysis of the paint, the canvas, the underdrawing, the specific material evidence that establishes whether a canvas is what it claims to be. The intersection of forgery, authentication, and restitution in the Modigliani market is one of the most complex territories in contemporary art world. It involves art historians, scientists, lawyers, and the specific expertise of people who have spent careers understanding how one of the 20th century's most celebrated artists actually worked. We have reached the end. Not the end of the issue. Art restitution is an ongoing, incomplete, urgently necessary process that will continue for decades. Not the end of the family's journeys. The Stettiner heirs will make decisions about the painting now in their possession that will shape its future for generations. Not the end of the broader reckoning with the legacy of Nazi looting that still has more to confront than it has addressed. But the end of this story, this particular story of one painting and one family in 11 years, what does it mean? It means that the law, when it is applied with the patience and determination that the Stettiner family applied to it, can reach across 80 years and undo an injustice. Not completely, not in a way that restores what was truly lost. The man who owned the painting, the world he lived in, the decades that his heirs spent without the connection to their history that the painting represents. But partially, meaningfully, in the specific, imperfect way that justice is always partial and meaningful. It means that institutions, even large, well-funded, legally sophisticated institutions, can be compelled to account for what is in their collections, that the combination of careful research, determined advocacy, and legal process can overcome the institutional inertia that has kept so much looted art in the wrong hands for so long. It means that the Washington Principles, for all their vagueness and their lack of enforcement mechanism, created a framework that, when pressed to its logical conclusion by families willing to do the pressing, produces real results. And it means something about memory, about what it means to not forget, about the specific form of resistance that consists of continuing to say, decade after decade, against every institutional argument and every procedural obstacle and every year that passes and every generation that ages, no, this was taken. It must be returned. Oscar Stettiner built something. He built a gallery. He built a collection. He bought a Modigliani and understood what he was looking at. The regime that confiscated his property and murdered his community believed that their actions were permanent, that what they took would stay taken, that what they destroyed would stay destroyed. They were wrong. The painting is coming home. 11 years of court dates and legal filings and expert witnesses and appeals and the grinding, expensive, exhausting machinery of justice. And the painting is coming home, not to the Paris of Oscar Stettiner. That Paris is gone. Not to him. He is gone too. To the people who carry his name and his memory and his unbroken claim on what was taken from him. To the descendants who refused to accept that theft was the end of the story. Who understood that some things, some claims, some rights, some truths, do not have a statute of limitations. The painting is coming home. And the woman in the portrait, Lunia Chichowska, with her dark eyes and her slightly tilted head and her century of witness to the worst and the best of what human beings do to each other, is finally, after everything, looking at the right people,